old. And we all know that the ladies usually live longer than the men, correct? And so we don't know, but Eve could have been 1,000 years old when she passed away. We don't know. It's just a pure speculation, of course. Although I think the ladies will agree with me, there are advantages not living 900, 1,000 years old. Is that right, ladies? Come on, Eve could have had children for 450 years. Hello? Yeah, I think some of you are starting to get the picture here. But we do have to be able to defend the fact that the Bible says this. And now after the flood, things changed. People started living 600, 450, 250, 125, etc. But before the flood, they were living an average over 900 years old. And why? Well, there's at least 19 reasons that are medical and scientific as to why people used to live to be 900 years old. And I think you've got to be able to defend some of that. Now, first of all, we have a chapter in my book that lists all 19 and some detail. This morning for Sunday school, we're not going to be able to get through all 19. We don't have enough time. But I do want to get some significant ones across. And these are easy to remember, really. But let's think about this. The world before the flood was totally different. As a matter of fact, if you take a look at Genesis 1, 9 and 10, on the third day of creation, God causes the dry land to rise up out of the water, and he separates the dry land and the water. And evolutionists, and remember, I used to be an evolutionary teacher, talk about this thing called Pangea. Well, that doesn't belong to the evolutionists. It belongs to us. If you had looked down at the Earth from a satellite at the end of day 3, you would have seen the continents basically fitting together. Now, there were some islands. We have the physical evidence to prove there were some islands, but most of the land did fit together, what is referred to as Pangea. Now, that broke apart at the time of the flood. I did a presentation called The Waters Cleaved, showing the maps of the earth that you can actually see the proof for Noah's flood, if you're allowed to. But initially, the land pretty much fit together and broke apart at the time of the flood. But the world before the flood was environmentally different, as well as land masses being in different places. To start off with, why do we no longer live to be 900 years old? Well, what you see here, this is actually a photograph of the chromosomes of a human being. In this case, we know that it is a male human being because the gender genes here, we have one X and one Y. And so we know that this is a male human here. You will remember ladies have two X's, men have one X, one Y. That's why generally when we have children, it's about a 50-50 split. Of course, there's something else that I could say about this. When I think that there's something important to men or something important to women, I always try to point it out. Now, guys, again, I would like you to notice men have one X and one Y chromosome for gender. Ladies have two X's, correct? Right, guys? This is why women are a doubly unknown quantity to men. Come on, X is an unknown quantity, and they got two. But what is the first and foremost reason why we no longer live to be 900 years old? Well, the fact of the matter is that here we see the 46 chromosomes of a human male, but the aging process is mostly the decay of genetic information. I have a new book that we just put out here on the table. I have several new books and a new video, but one of them is called Genetic Entropy. Now, that may sound like a mouthful. It's actually a fairly easy book to read. But most of the aging process is because of human sin in the garden, causing the initiation of a decay process, which simply goes on and gets bigger and bigger. As a matter of fact, I'd like to think about something. Human DNA mutates, and mutation means copying error. A mutation is a copying error, but in the human body, we have 1,000 to 1 million mutations per day. Now, a significantly good-sized man has about 85 trillion cells. You got 1,000 to 1 million mistakes per day per cell. It's kind of like a lot. Hello? But the more important thing is we now know from genetic studies. Now, we understood the human DNA in April of 2003. We still don't know where the periods and commas and semicolons are. We don't know where the sentences and the paragraphs are. But 21 years ago, we figured out the alphabet. But today we are losing 1 to 2% of our genetic information per generation. I like you to think about that. I love my grandchildren, but they have 2 to 4% less genetic information in their bodies than I do. It is absolutely true that your great-grandparents were individually more intelligent and had faster reaction times than we do today because of this decay. And I'd like you to think about this. Sitting right where you are today, you are approximately the 250th copy from the original. There's been about 250 generations since creation, and today we're losing 1 to 2% per generation, correct? But because of sin in the garden, why did we live to be 900? We had perfect DNA. Now, if you had perfect DNA, you'd live longer, right? And because of sin in the garden, well, the decay process was very minor. A few mistakes and so forth, not a big deal. But it's like a snowball going downhill. The mistakes don't get corrected, and they simply continue to get worse and worse. And today we're adding between 75 and 175 permanent mistakes. We're going downhill, and we are going downhill fast. Now, I would also point out to you, this is a scientific reason to know the Lord's coming back soon. Y'all could have said amen. But this is one reason we know scientifically the Lord's coming back soon. Because if this keeps going, we won't be here when he returns. Are you with me? Because if this keeps going much longer, we will become sterile and will become extinct. And I think you'll agree that's about the ultimate harm, correct? Come on, becoming extinct is kind of like a bad thing, right? But we know that we're going to be here when the Lord comes back. I mean, people will be. And so this is one reason we know that, in fact, the Lord's going to come back soon. I didn't say a year. I didn't say when. I just said he will. Okay? But, God in his infinite foreknowledge knew that this was going to happen because of human sin, correct? And this whole decay process. Now, generally in science, it's called the second law of thermodynamics. It's kind of a big term, but that's the basis of it. Everything goes downhill. Evolution say things get bigger, better, faster, smarter. That's not true. Everything in science tells us that things are getting, smaller, slower, and dumber. And that's true. I mean, if you think you're smart now, think about how smart you would be with a perfect human mind. We don't even come close. Now, God knows this in his foreknowledge. He knows what's going to happen. So what did God do? He put 7 little machines. I won't go through them, but there's 7 little machines he permanently placed inside your DNA. They almost never break, and they correct the minor mistakes that are made every single day. These are little machines pre-programmed in your DNA. They go up and down the chromosomes every single day, correcting the minor mistakes. Now, it will not correct major mistakes like hemophilia and sickle cell anemia and so forth, but it does correct the minor mistakes. If it were not for that, you wouldn't be here. Hello? This is really important. But what else? Well, first of all, this is sort of an illustration of the Earth's magnetic field. Now, you remember when you were in school, probably even elementary school, much less junior high school, they were teaching about magnetism, right? And you had a compass, and the needle pointed north and south, right? But lab experiments have proven that, first of all, heavy doses of magnetism from conception to puberty increase longevity because it stabilizes chromosomes. So I'm sorry it's too late for any of you. But this is very important, the Earth's magnetic field. Number one, it is in a process of decay. It has a half-life of 1,400 years. We've lost 95% of the energy in the Earth's magnetic field since creation 6,000 years ago. Well, first of all, that's one reason why we don't live as long, because First of all, we no longer are able to stabilize the chromosomes as we once were able to do so. If you're interested, I've got the information in my book. But you're going to find out that sometimes these various things have more than one benefit. Now, the Earth's magnetism has multiple benefits. First of all, 6,000 years ago, it would have helped to stabilize the chromosomes. Well, that would help you to live longer, right? But what else? This is a projection showing the Earth's magnetic field, which is called the magnetosphere, and the solar winds. Now, the solar winds coming from the sun, but we also have galactic winds as well. But the solar winds are the ones that affect us the most. This is deadly radiation. You may not realize this, but space is an incredibly hazardous place. It may seem like a vacuum out there, but it's full of really bad stuff. And, well, the Earth's magnetosphere, that protects us from this deadly radiation coming from the sun. As is illustrated here, the radiation comes towards the Earth, but the Earth's magnetic field, because this deadly radiation is ionized, it's plus or minus charged. And so what happens? Well, it hits the magnetosphere, bent around and comes in at the North Pole and the South Pole, where so few people live. Isn't that a good design? Oh, come on, folks. That's a good design. Now, this deadly radiation is certainly well known to you, even if you were not aware of quite this mechanism. But for example, it's what causes what's called the northern and southern lights, the aurora australis, the aurora borealis. And it's pretty. You know, until 2 years ago, with the invasion of the Ukraine, I had gone to Russia 59 times. And I've been above the Arctic Circle, many of those trips. And the northern lights are pretty, no doubt about it. But they're also hazardous. They're deadly. I lost a friend a few years ago up in Murmansk. She was 38 years old, the wife of a pastor with 4 children. She died at 38 because she had lived her entire life under this radiation. This is serious stuff. Another thing, too, though, how many of you remember the Van Allen radiation belts? Okay. How many of you remember the space program back when we went to the moon? There's got to be at least 3 people here that do. At least. But let's think about this for a second. Again, what is the most hazardous thing in space? It's not weightlessness. It's not available oxygen or available water and so forth. The most hazardous thing in space is radiation. And that's why we retire astronauts after a certain period of time in space, because they have absorbed as much radiation as we dare let them absorb. And back in the early days, in the 60s, we were going to the moon, and we knew of 2 Van Allen radiation belts. Now we know there's a third. But what are these Van Allen radiation belts? This is where that deadly radiation is trapped well above us by the Earth's magnetic field. And again, this is where it then bounces down to the North Pole or up to the South Pole. But we only knew of 2 back in those days in the 60s. Today we now know there's 3. And the most dangerous thing we do is shoot an astronaut through these radiation belts and on out into outer space. Now, how many of you would want to volunteer to go to Mars, a 3-year trip, exposed to all that radiation on the lowest priced vehicle they could find? Yes, I know I have a little competition, but the rest of you could at least laugh at the jokes occasionally. So the Earth's magnetic field has multiple benefits, right? It stabilizes chromosomes, can prevent us from having deadly radiation. Now think about it. Today we have lost 95% of the Earth's magnetic field. Well, why? What is one of the reasons that cancer rates are going straight up? It's because we're losing this protection. But 6,000 years ago, with 95% more energy, the Earth's magnetic sphere went out much, much farther, pushed that radiation much further away from us. But today, what's happening? Well, it's leaking through and getting closer and closer all the time. And this is one reason why the cancer rates are going straight up. And there's nothing you can do to prevent this. But what else? Genesis 1:7, God says that on day 2, he created the waters above and the waters below. I know you're familiar with that term, right? Now, when I taught on the flood, the presentation over here called the waters cleaved, on day 2, God created a layer of water 1 mile thick, 10 to 11 miles down, and that is what flooded most of the earth at the time of the flood. But he also created the waters above, correct? Now, the waters above, we're talking about some extra humidity in the atmosphere. Now, I know in North Georgia that's a little hard to believe, but come to Florida with me. I'll yes, anyway, but the moisture above, that moisture above that he put there is not a canopy. That concept is totally wrong. The earth never had a canopy of clouds. First of all, let's think about the consequences if that were true. The only canopied planet in our system today is Venus. I can say with absolute authority, we will never land a human being on Venus. If you're not familiar why, first of all, Venus is the second brightest object in the sky at night behind the moon. Okay, so often you will see it near the moon, nice bright spot in the sky, right? But we're never going to go there and land. First of all, of course, it's easy to see because it's surrounded by white clouds reflecting sunlight, makes it really easy, right? But those clouds are made out of sulfuric acid. Some of you need to think about that, apparently. And because of that cloud canopy, now it's a bit closer to the sun, but because of the cloud canopy, how many of you know here on a cloudy night, it doesn't get as cool as a clear night, correct? Because of radiation. And well, the clouds on Venus trap all that heat coming from the sun. And the temperature on the surface of Venus is about 850 degrees Fahrenheit, which is why we're never going to go there. It's a really good reason. But the moisture we have in the atmosphere at the time of creation is only like 5%, 10% more than today. So it's not a lot, but it would keep the earth warmer all over. We'd have subtropical like temperatures all over from the pole to the pole. No, I work alone now. I have a helper coming my way. But think about the consequences of this little bit of extra moisture. Well, first of all, you would have no seasons at all. As a matter of fact, if you remember Genesis 8:22, after the flood, God says, now you will have winter, summer, spring, fall. But before the flood of Noah, there were no seasons. It was basically very uniform from pole to pole. But think of the advantages of this. First of all, I think you'll agree with fairly uniform kind of subtropical temperatures and so forth. Heat does kill, but cold kills more often. And so one reason you would live longer is you don't have those temperature extremes, right? But think about some of the other benefits as well. How many of you, well, I shouldn't say it quite that way, but you're certainly aware of farming, correct? Now, in North Georgia, what is the single biggest problem that a farmer has? Well, the single biggest problem is not rain, it's not fertilizer, it's not seed, it's crop failure. I mean, think about it up here in North Georgia. You got one shot at getting a crop, correct? Now, for instance, you were growing corn. You've got one season to grow corn here, and if the corn fails to come in, you're in big trouble, correct? Because you've got to be prepared to go a second year without a crop, and that's not real easy. But I live in Florida. And in Florida, we can grow 2 crops of corn every year. As a matter of fact, we harvest our corn in April, maybe May, and we ship it up here because you'd like to have some fresh corn and you don't have any of your own, and you're willing to pay the freight. But in the summertime, you've got your own. But in the fall, we harvest corn in October and November in Florida because you've run out of yours and you'd like to have some fresh corn and you're willing to pay the freight. Hello? We could grow 3 crops of corn in Florida. It's just not economic. But we do grow 2. We grow radishes on a 28-day rotation. We could grow 12 crops of radishes in a year. And think about the consequences of that. You know, God said because of human sin, you were going to have to toil to get your food, but food was plentiful. I mean, think about it up here. You have one season to make a crop, but before the flood, you could grow your crop, harvest it, prepare the field, and plant the next day, and just keep going. Kind of neat, huh? Food was plentiful, but you had to make an effort. But that higher humidity, and that's what it is. It's not clouds, but a higher humidity has additional benefits. For example, the extra moisture would help to filter out, not totally, but would help to filter out ultraviolet radiation. Now, I'm expecting to see some hands after my next question. How many of y'all remember when men hired barbers and ladies had hair salons? Oh, and how many of you can remember that back in those days, well, they were using the same scissors and the same combs from client to client. But to make sure that they didn't transfer lice and bacteria and so forth, what did they do? They had this little box on the counter that had 5 sides and mirrors on 5 sides, and one side was open so you could put the scissors and the combs in and take them back out again. And there was a blue light in there as well. Anybody remember those? I do. Aha. What is that blue light? It's an ultraviolet lamp, because ultraviolet light kills living organisms. And so we used to put the scissors and the combs from client to client. We just put them in there. The mirrors bounced the ultraviolet light all around, and it sterilized them in the scissors. It was a really, really. You don't see that anymore. Now, why don't you see that anymore? We use chemicals and disposables today, and the reason is because ultraviolet light causes cataracts. We found that the men and women working in these stores and shops, they were getting cataracts faster. So if you, first of all, want to slow down the development of cataracts, remember that every day, I don't care whether it's December the 1st or July 4th, every day you're outside, you should be wearing sunglasses with blue blockers. Now, I'm not selling sunglasses. I want you to know that. But I am saying this for your benefit. You need to be getting not only sunglasses, but you've got to have blue blocker. That blocks out the ultraviolet light. And it will slow down the development of cataracts. Well, what else? Now, before the flood, there was basically no or very little earthquake or volcanic activity. Now, think with me for just a moment. We do a presentation on Mount St. Helens, erupted May the 18th, 1980, Sunday morning, about 8:32. And, 57 people died that day. Now, they died from terminal stupidity. Well, they were told not to be there, but they chose to anyway. You know how some people are, I know better? Well, that day, 57 people died because they said, I know better, and they didn't. I would point out to you, though, the volcano erupted north. If it had erupted facing west, 50,000 people would have died that day. But today we have warnings of volcanoes. I think you'll agree. We have sensors. We see earthquake swarms. We know that there's things going on, and we try to get people away and warn them, correct? But how many of you remember getting up on a Sunday morning to come to church sometime in your life, and you turned on the radio or the TV, and that morning you found out there was an earthquake in Afghanistan, and 10,000 people died that day because their houses simply fell in on top of them. You've heard that kind of stuff, right? Oh, but before the flood, you didn't have that. And so if you didn't have those kind of conditions, you'd probably live longer on average, right? Oh, and then of course, how about pollution? You know, environmental terrorists, tree huggers, Igor. It's my pet name for Al Gore. But you know, they're trying to get us to go back and live in caves. But the fact of the matter is that nature pollutes, and nature pollutes more than people. One volcano on Earth pollutes more in 1 year than I mean, there's the Hawaiian Islands have active volcanoes all the time. We have new volcanoes in the Red Sea. We have new volcanoes all over the earth, and nature is not pristine. Nature pollutes, and it pollutes a lot. Now, with that in mind, as a matter of fact, ocean life pollutes probably as more than volcanoes. But let's think about this for a second. I've lived in Orlando now for 51 years, and I would drive from Orlando to Tampa occasionally. And in the early years that we lived there, they built a power plant, an electric power plant down near Lakeland, Florida. You could see it from the Interstate 4. And today, because of environmental terrorists, that plant has to release air into the atmosphere cleaner than it takes in. Excuse me. How many of you want to pay for your electric bill and pay to clean the atmosphere at the same time? Just a question. But what about additional things that were different before the flood and that'll cause people today to live shorter lifespans? Well, first of all, let's think about this. God gave us at that time a perfect diet. Genesis 1, 29, 30. God said, I give you the green plant. It should be similar to meat to your body. And he gave us a perfect diet at creation. I'm also eternally grateful for Genesis 9:3. And anybody who has had a meal with me will know in Genesis 9:3, God says, now you shall eat meat. And I take God very seriously. But initially, he gave us the green plant and provided everything we needed. And remember, we had a perfect digestive system. We had a perfect immune system. Think about that. You couldn't get sick. Hello? Well, you might live longer, huh? Oh. And that extra moisture above, though, has additional benefits to longevity. Now, remember, again, that humans and animals were vegetarians at creation, and the plants provided everything. But because of human sin, what happened? Well, the land would become less fertile, correct? At the time of the flood, a lot of the nutrients in the ground were dissolved into the oceans, and they're no longer available to us directly. And again, after the flood, God knows this, so now he says you're going to have to eat meat too to supplement what's missing. But again, the higher, let's face it, I've been up here many times. How about on a rainy or a foggy day up here in the mountains? The air just feels heavier, doesn't it? Come on, it feels heavier, right? And you can take a cubic foot of air and it's dry and add moisture to it until you reach saturation. And that cubic foot of air literally does get heavier. With that in mind, when God put all of that water up there, what's that going to do? It's going to make the air up there way more, correct? And that's going to increase the pressure down here. That is very beneficial to longevity. Now, we know that it's true because of, say, air bubbles trapped in amber. By the way, the latest research proves that amber only forms underwater. Hello? Only forms underwater. Hint, kind of sounds like a worldwide flood, doesn't it? Right? I mean, how else did all those tree things get in amber? It had to be underwater. But we have many sources to prove this. Remember that insects don't breathe through nostrils. They don't breathe through their mouths and so forth. This is one reason why there were none intentionally on the ark. They survived on the floating debris of the flood. But they do breathe through little holes in the side of their body called spiracles. And the size and longevity of an insect is not based upon how long it lives. It is based upon how much oxygen it can get during its lifetime. Now, again, we know that this is true. Now, I am not afraid to quote evolutionary material because evolutionary material often proves creation to be true. So while I am referencing here evolutionary thinking, but an oxygen-rich environment allowed gigantic insects to grow, and then they say 300 million, I say supposed years ago. Dragonflies with up to 36-inch wingspans. I'm sure you've been driving down to Atlanta and you saw some of those dragonflies with 36-inch wingspans, right? Yeah. Um, but evolutionists long suspected that since they would need more oxygen, then the oxygen content of the atmosphere must have been much stronger back then. No, they are not taking into account the extra pressure. Again, this comes from an evolutionary source, New Scientist. Plants, marine life preferentially take up isotopes of carbon, sulfur, and their absorption changes as the concentration of oxygen rises. That's from Science, the second highest scientific journal in the world for evolutionists. Analysis of these isotopes in ancient rocks, as they think, shows the oxygen content of the atmosphere peaked at 35%, going back into the Carboniferous age. No, that's not true. After all, if you would light a match, you'd set a forest on fire at that rate. But let's think about this. Time magazine. Now, Time magazine is a totally evolutionary publication. And notice it goes all the way back to 1987, but they say there was 50% more oxygen. No, they're not taking into account that there was double pressure, because that extra moisture would cause the atmosphere to be about 1.6 to 2.2 times what it is today. I mean, think about it. Adam could have run from Damascus to Egypt without getting winded. Come on, you got twice the oxygen. But this comes from North Carolina State University, a publication in New Scientist, again, an evolutionary university and an evolutionary publication. But notice, over 20 years ago, they did an experiment. They took ginkgo plants, raised them in an artificial atmosphere of 5 times the carbon dioxide, 1.5 times the oxygen as today, and the plants grew 3 times faster. Think about the environmental terrorists for just a moment. They want you to lower your carbon footprint. They want to sequester carbon dioxide in the ground at a large expense. What is the truth? The truth is we ought to be, please notice what I'm saying carefully here, we ought to be burning all of the, natural gas, etc., as fast as we could if it were for a useful purpose, and release what we have sequestered, because the plants would just absorb it. They don't know anything about science, folks. It's an ideology. But think with me. We have a growing population, up to 8 billion right now. And we need food for a growing population. Now, what do plants use to grow food? Come on, folks. That was kind of a gimme. Come on. What? CO2. Carbon dioxide. What do trees use to make wood? Come on, that's another gimme. And we ought to be releasing it, as long as for a useful purpose, as fast as we could, because the plants would simply absorb it. We'd have more food, more wood, which we do need for a growing population, correct? Aha. Well, what else? I don't mean to disturb anybody. I realize you might have had breakfast before you came to church. But these are human red blood cells. Now, why would I show them to you? Well, there's a really good reason. Under double atmospheric pressure, which is approximately what we had from creation to the flood, well, it isn't just the red blood cells that carry oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. It's the entire fluid. Now, I don't really want to bring up a negative thought, but I want you to think about it nonetheless. How many of you remember back in 2006, Sago coal mine accident up in West Virginia? 13 miners were trapped underground, 12 died, 1 survived. Why? Well, first of all, he was separated from the other 12. He was in a different part of the mine. And the 12 died from carbon monoxide poisoning. Now, why do you die from carbon monoxide poisoning? Well, it just so happens that the hemoglobin in your blood likes carbon monoxide more than it likes oxygen. And so what happens? Well, you actually drown breathing. Because what happens? The cells absorb the carbon monoxide. There's no room for the oxygen to get in and no place for the carbon dioxide to get out. And you literally asphyxiate. Now, Mr. McCloy did survive, but why? He was almost dead when we found him, but as soon as we did find him alive, we slapped pure oxygen right on his face. We evacuated him out to a hospital, and we put him in one of those. This is a hyperbaric chamber. Hyperbaric oxygen is really good because hyperbaric oxygen heals. And of course, what happens? Your body is making millions of new blood cells per minute, and it's getting rid of millions of red blood cells per minute. And what happens? If we can keep you alive long enough, your new cells come in and can carry the oxygen in, the carbon dioxide out. The contaminated cells are eliminated. So if we can keep you alive long enough, we'll just naturally replace it, right? Now, hyperbaric oxygen has a lot of benefits. First of all, treating of stroke patients. If you can do this for the first 3 weeks, we have phenomenal results in not having the devastating effect of many strokes. But in addition to that, MS patients, some of them do very well with hyperbaric oxygen. In France, arthritis, vascular necrosis, sclerosis of the liver, other advanced liver diseases, plastic and cosmetic surgery. Now, we're going to have to close here in just a moment, but I'd like to point something out to you. I'm going to show you a photograph of a lady who had her face transplanted. Hello? I am not going to show you what she looked like before the surgery. But on the left, this is just a couple months after the surgery. And you can actually see where half the face was replaced. And on the right, after only a few more months, she looks pretty normal. She did die 2 years ago of natural causes, but nonetheless, we know of one other woman and one man that have had their face transplanted. We would never try that kind of surgery if it were not for hyperbaric oxygen. We know how to do the microsurgery. We can put things back together again. When you cut off extremities and so forth, we know how to sew them back together. The problem is getting enough oxygen to keep the tissue alive until circulation is regenerated. And in Japan, sudden deafness, blindness. Sweden, diabetic gangrene, Berger's disease. Belgium, again, reattachment of parts that have been cut off. And in India, they actually use it for leprosy. Leprosy is a disease very similar to diabetic the death of the tissue with leprosy and diabetic conditions, the nephritis that comes from that. And so again, with hyperbaric oxygen, we can keep these tissues alive. Now, there's lots of other reasons why people used to live to be 1900 years. It is not just one of them. It is all of them taken together in combination. But we have the scientific, the medical evidence to prove people really could live to be 900 years old under the environmental conditions that existed from creation to the flood. And we can defend it. You don't have to believe evolutionists. Hello? Well, thanks for coming to Sunday School. I hope you got something out of it anyway. And we just started. Hello. Thank you. We're going to put the screen up and so forth. The tables are available for the next 15 minutes until the service starts. I'll be happy to answer any questions too. I mean, it's not just the material, but questions, whatever. I'll be up here for you. Okay. Thanks a lot.